Okay, so it's been a little while since we've done one of these, but we are going to begin this screencast with the eruption of the Spanish-American War. We discussed in class a lot of tension brewing between the United States and Spain, largely due to public opinion and tension with yellow journalism. But eventually, President McKinley is going to ask Congress to declare war after the explosion of the USS Maine. And in 1899, the United States will officially declare war on Spain. Now, as you may have researched, the first location that the U.S. will fight the Spanish is actually in the Philippines. And if you know anything about Asian geography, you know that the Philippines are not located anywhere near Spain or the United States or even Cuba. It's off the coast of mainland Asia, a little bit south of China. And this is just displaying that the Spanish were actually imperializing the Philippines at this point in time. So just all of those practices with imperialism we've been discussing, the Spanish were very much present and kind of occupying the Philippines. And so since it is one of their colonies, we will attack the Spanish at the Philippines. So we're not actually fighting the Filipino people, we're fighting the Spanish just in their domain. USS Admiral Dewey, George Dewey, will lead a U.S. fleet that will sail into Manila Bay, where he's able to defeat the Spanish successfully. And the Filipino people actually aided the Americans, hoping that if and when the Americans, overthrew the Spanish, that they would allow the Filipino people to be independent, and, remove the Spanish and just give them control of their country back. But we all know that's not going to happen, at least not right away. So when the Spanish do surrender, the U.S. retained the Philippines as a protectorate, or it's just, overseeing political relations of the Philippines and vowing to intervene and protect it if something were to come up, or if a nation were to threaten it. But that is a form of imperialism. The United States will also be fighting the Spanish in the Caribbean, since Cuba was obviously the point of contention at the time. That's kind of what brought us into this. We will talk about our fight in Cuba. You might recognize the soldier on this bottom left picture, the character that Robin Williams is playing in Night at the Museum. That's Teddy Roosevelt. Again, before his years as president, he was a war hero, and we kind of introduce him here. The U.S. did have somewhat of a navy, and we were able to blockade Cuban ports, which will, help cut off Cuba's, and really the Spanish, from being able to deliver resources and supplies. But the reality of the situation is our army is weak. We do not have a very established army. It's made up of poorly trained, poorly equipped volunteer soldiers. We didn't really have super modern weapons for the times. And honestly, we're going to have, high casualties, although most people who die will actually die from illness and from meatpacking industry, unsanitary factors, just to kind of connect to the turn of the century we talked about in the last unit. But there is one group of volunteer cavalrymen called the Rough Riders, and the Rough Riders are led by Teddy Roosevelt. They will have multiple successes in Cuba, I think San Juan, Kettle Hill. You don't need to know the names of these battles, but he is successful. I did want to, establish that Teddy and the Rough Riders get a large amount of public credit for the victories, but they weren't the only groups who had success in these fights. There were other cavalry groups, there were minority volunteer fighters, a group called the Railroads. None of those groups get the credit that Teddy's group gets, but that is kind of what puts him in the spotlight. And as you know, he becomes a future politician and future president. Eventually, the U.S. fleet will defeat the Spanish at Santiago, and at that point, the Spanish will surrender at Cuba. The whole thing, didn't last but 6 months, which compared to other wars is not very long. Just to add on to fighting in the Caribbean before I get to the treaty, Puerto Rico was another colony of the Spanish. They were, imperializing Puerto Rico. And in this war, we also seized Puerto Rico without a fight. They surrender, immediately upon American arrival. Again, we're not fighting the Puerto Ricans, we're fighting the Spanish in Puerto Rico. So, with that final surrender, though, in Cuba, the fighting's pretty much over. McKinley, I believe, not McKinley, the Secretary of War, someone in the White House called it a splendid little war, which I think is kind of funny, a little bit comical. But bottom line is, wars end with treaties, and the treaty that ends the Spanish-American War is the Treaty of Paris, 1898. Yes, this is another Treaty of Paris. So please know the year 1898, just so we don't get confused. With the Treaty of Paris, Cuba gains independence from Spain, but the American government is still overseeing, and we'll talk about that. Spain cedes. Okay, so cession, think about like when Mexico gave us that portion of land in the Southwest, starts with the C. Mexico ceded both of Puerto Rico and Guam to the U.S., so we absorbed those two territories that were once Spanish, occupied, and now will become part of our own and are still territories of the U.S. to this day. And the third big part of the Treaty of Paris, 1898, is that Spain will sell the Philippines to the United States for $20 million. Now, you might think that because we won, we can just, claim what's ours. But that's not how this works. The treaties involve negotiation. And we were not fighting this war for the Philippines. We were more so fighting in our region in the Caribbean. Philippines just does get brought into it. Kind of consider the fact that the bigger goal here is to engage in imperialism and to kind of compete at Europe's game. And so we do have to make a financial transaction. They're not just going to give it to us like they did Puerto Rico and Guam. Think about the connection to Asia. Think about the proximity and why the United States government would be interested in this purchase. We will retain the Philippines for a while, and we'll talk about that more in this chapter. I did want to talk a little bit about Puerto Rico and Cuba today, just very briefly, and then we'll stop for today. So, Puerto Rico was honestly hoping, just like what Philippines were hoping, like once the Spanish were overthrown by the U.S., that it would be allowed independence. But Puerto Rico is geographically important to the U.S. to maintain a level of influence in the Caribbean, and also for the future building of the Panama Canal, which we will talk about later. So kind of just think about that. But we will talk about the Panama Canal later in this chapter. So we basically say that we're going to protect the property, we're going to oversee it. Puerto Rico eventually becomes a commonwealth, okay, in the 1950s. As a commonwealth nation, this means that U.S. Constitution doesn't necessarily apply, but they do have to approve, like the United States government would have to approve of all laws and regulations within the Puerto Rican government. Puerto Ricans are allowed to travel, freely between the U.S. and the United States, between the U.S. and Puerto Rico. They are citizens. They are allowed to be drafted in the military. They do have voting rights, but they're not allowed to vote in presidential elections. Consider the fact that in presidential elections, it's actually the Electoral College that sends, or that, those votes actually count. And as the fact that Puerto Rico is not a state, it doesn't have electoral votes in that equation. But Puerto Rico is allowed to send representatives to Congress to kind of speak on behalf and represent Puerto Rican interests. So there's been multiple votes. This is more of just a side note, but there's been multiple votes within the Puerto Rican government whether or not they would be requesting statehood. I think most people acknowledge that if we were to ever acquire an additional state to make it 51, that Puerto Rico would be the most likely candidate But that ball's been in Puerto Rico's court, and they have voted no in multiple elections, including as late as 1998. They voted to stay a Commonwealth. I think that they embrace the privileges that come with being part of an American territory with the travel, being able to travel easily to mainland. But I think that there's a Latino culture there that they fear would be kind of dissolved if they were to fully be instated into the United States. So I think it's a happy medium. And then, I said that last vote was in 1898. In 1998. 1898 was the Treaty of Paris treaty. I mentioned like that being the last vote, which is, 20 years ago at this point. But something kind of interesting is there's been a lot of political, kind of controversy with how the federal government has handled crisis in Puerto Rico in the past several years. They've had hurricanes, they've had earthquakes, they've had some pretty disastrous events with questionable American intervention. So I'd imagine that left a bad taste in the mouth of Puerto Rican government. And, so I think that would maybe affect, I guess my point is I don't know how a vote would look today. It might even be less likely that they would want to be a part of the U.S. But I'm not sure. Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about really quickly is Cuba. So, Cuba was technically given its independence after the Spanish-American War. We were just overseeing it as a protectorate. Initially, we promised. Initially during the war, we passed an act of legislation that said that, oh no, y'all will be completely independent. But that gets completely voided. Cuba is, geographically, regionally important to the U.S. as well. Eventually, what happens is that the U.S. Has the Cubans amend their constitution to include something called the Platt Amendment. I'll never necessarily ask you this is a term, but I think it's interesting. The Platt Amendment basically states that the U.S. Would absorb Cuba as a protectorate, meaning we have the right to oversee Cuban affairs in the good interests of the Cuban people themselves, and that we had the right to intervene in Cuba if Cuba was ever unstable. All of those ties, of course, will be cut off around the time of the Cold War. If you're familiar with a man by the name of Castro, he kind of ends all of that. We'll talk about that later. The other thing, though, that we had Cuba add to their constitution was that they would lease harbors to the United States for naval bases. This includes Guantanamo Bay, if you're familiar with that military base and prison. Alrighty. If you have any questions about this, please feel free to write them down. We'll discuss Monday before we conclude the chapter. I hope you all have a great weekend, and I will see you then.